A fire doesn't just begin, it needs a spark, fuel, and air. But when three separate blazes erupted simultaneously across the Hartwell Plantation in the Carolina Low Country on the night of August 14, 1823, one in the cotton gin house, another in the main residence's kitchen wing, and the third in the overseer's quarters nearly 300 yards away, investigators found themselves facing an impossibility. The local magistrate's report, sealed for 43 years and only discovered during courthouse renovations in 1866, contained a single handwritten note in the margin: "No rational explanation exists." What happened that night destroyed more than property. It unraveled a web of secrets so carefully maintained that an entire community had conspired, consciously or not, to keep them buried. And the most disturbing part? Nearly everyone involved knew exactly what was coming. Before we continue with the story of the Hartwell Plantation, I need you to do something important. If you're intrigued by historical mysteries that make you question what really happened, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our stories. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Are there any dark historical events from your area you'd like us to explore? Now, let's return to that August night in 1823 and the days that led up to it, because nothing that happened was truly sudden. The Carolina Low Country in 1823 was a landscape of extremes. Vast rice and cotton plantations stretched across the coastal plains, their prosperity built entirely on the labor of enslaved people, who outnumbered their enslavers nearly 6-to-1 in some counties. The Hartwell Plantation, situated along a tributary of the Cooper River about 18 miles northwest of Charleston, was neither the largest nor the wealthiest in the region, but it had earned a particular reputation, though few spoke of it openly. Thomas Hartwell had inherited the property from his father in 1819. He was 34 years old, educated in Charleston and briefly in Philadelphia, a man who prided himself on what he called efficient management practices. His wife, Catherine, 26, had come from a declining Charleston merchant family, bringing little dowry but excellent social connections. They had 2 children, Margaret, age 6, and Thomas Jr., age 3. The family occupied a 2-story frame house with broad piazzas, typical of the region, painted white with dark green shutters. The plantation worked 312 acres, with approximately 78 enslaved people living in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house and near the fields. The overseer, a man named Gideon Yates, occupied a smaller house on the eastern edge of the property. He'd been hired by the elder Hartwell in 1816 and had remained through the ownership transfer. A man in his late 40s, known for rigid discipline and an ability to extract maximum productivity. But there was something else about the Hartwell Plantation, something whispered about in Charleston parlors and discussed in careful code at church gatherings. 3 enslaved people had died there in the span of 18 months, officially from fever, injury, and childbirth complications. The deaths themselves weren't unusual for the time and place. Such tragedies were grimly common across the plantation south. What made people uneasy was the timing of each death, each occurring shortly after that person had been seen arguing with Yates or had been singled out for punishment. The summer of 1823 had been particularly brutal. Temperatures climbed above 90 degrees for weeks, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. The cotton crop demanded constant attention, and Hartwell, facing debts from a failed speculation in Charleston real estate, pushed for increased production. Yates, in turn, pushed the enslaved workers harder than ever before. Among those workers was a woman named Dinah, about 40 years old, who worked primarily in the main house as a cook and domestic servant. She'd been born on the plantation and had seen 3 of her children sold away over the years, a common and devastating practice. She had a daughter, Ruth, 19, who also worked in the house, and a son, Samuel, 16, who worked in the fields. Dinah had a quiet strength about her, a steadiness that other enslaved people relied on. She rarely spoke unnecessarily, but when she did, people listened. There was also Jacob, a man in his early 30s, one of the most skilled workers on the plantation. He could repair almost anything: broken tools, damaged wagon wheels, even clock mechanisms. This skill made him valuable, but also gave him slightly more freedom of movement than others. He'd been purchased by the elder Hartwell from a plantation in Virginia in 1815, separated from his wife and infant son in the process, a wound that never healed. And there was Moses, a man of about 50, who served as the informal spiritual leader among the enslaved community. He led prayer meetings on Sunday afternoons, speaking in a low, resonant voice that could make biblical passages feel like prophecy. He'd learned to read. How, no one knew for certain, but literacy among the enslaved was both rare and dangerous. If Yates had discovered this, the punishment would have been severe. The tension on the plantation had been building for months, invisible to the Hartwells, but palpable to everyone else. It started with small things. Tools that mysteriously broke just when they were most needed, a fence gate left unlatched allowing livestock to wander, a cooking fire that nearly went out during dinner preparations, forcing a delay in the family's evening meal. Each incident was minor, easily explained as accident or negligence, but their frequency increased through July and into August. Yates responded with stricter discipline, reducing already meager rations, extending work hours into the evening, and increasing the use of physical punishment. The plantation became a pressure vessel with no release valve. On August 10th, 4 days before the fire, something happened that would later be remembered as significant, though at the time it seemed like just another ugly incident in an ugly system. A young man named Peter, 17 years old, had been accused of working too slowly in the cotton fields. Yates decided to make an example of him, administering a public whipping in the yard between the enslaved people's cabins. The punishment was savage enough that Peter could barely stand afterward. Dinah and Ruth were ordered to tend to his injuries. That evening, as the sun set and the enslaved community gathered in the spaces between their cabins, something shifted. Moses led a prayer meeting as he often did, but witnesses would later recall that the prayers that night felt different, more like declarations than supplications. He spoke about the Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, about walls falling at Jericho, about plagues visited upon Egypt. His voice never rose above its usual measured tone, but every word seemed weighted with intention. "The Lord sees," he said, looking not at his listeners but at some distant point beyond them. "Every tear, every drop of blood, every cry in the night. And the Lord remembers." Dinah sat at the edge of the gathering, her face unreadable. Jacob stood in the shadows, his skilled hands motionless for once. Ruth held Peter's hand as he sat, still trembling from pain. That night Hartwell sat in his study reviewing account books, calculating debts and projected profits. The numbers didn't align the way he needed them to. He needed a better yield, needed higher prices, needed fewer expenses. The people he enslaved were listed in those books as assets, their monetary value carefully noted. He saw only numbers. Catherine sat in the parlor with Margaret, teaching her daughter to embroider, trying to maintain the pretense of refinement, even as she felt the oppressive heat and growing unease that seemed to emanate from the very land itself. She'd heard the whispers about the plantation, about her husband's management, about Yates's methods. She'd chosen not to think about them too deeply. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended tension. The weather grew even hotter, the air so thick it seemed almost solid. Afternoon thunderstorms threatened but never arrived, leaving only dark clouds that massed on the horizon and then dissipated. The enslaved people worked in near silence, communicating through glances and small gestures. Yates prowled the property constantly, sensing something but unable to identify what. On the evening of August 13th, Dinah prepared the family's dinner as usual. She moved through the kitchen with automatic precision, her face revealing nothing. Ruth assisted her, their movements synchronized from years of working together. They served the meal: rice, ham, greens, biscuits, and the Hartwell family ate, discussing their plans to visit Charleston the following week, completely unaware of anything unusual. After the family retired, Dinah and Ruth cleaned the kitchen, banking the cooking fire as they did every night. They left the kitchen wing and walked back to their cabin. Dinah paused at the door, looking back at the main house, standing pale in the moonlight. Ruth watched her mother's face, seeing something she couldn't quite interpret. "Tomorrow," Dinah said quietly. It wasn't a question or a prediction, just a statement of fact. Jacob had spent the day repairing a broken wheel on one of the cotton wagons. As evening fell, he'd carefully organized his tools, accounting for each one with unusual precision. He'd cleaned them thoroughly, wrapping some in oiled cloth as if preparing for a long period of storage. He worked slowly, methodically, seeming almost to be performing a ritual rather than simple maintenance. Moses spent the evening with several of the older members of the enslaved community, speaking in low tones. They sat in a rough circle, and though no written records exist of what was said, those who passed by later remarked that the conversation seemed less like planning and more like prayer, or perhaps farewell. Yates retired to his quarters around 9 o'clock, as was his habit. His house was a simple 4-room structure, functional rather than comfortable, smelling of tobacco and kerosene. He undressed, reviewed the next day's work assignments in his mind, and climbed into bed. He fell asleep quickly, never a man troubled by conscience. The Hartwell family went to bed around 10. Thomas checked the locks on the doors, a nightly ritual. Catherine looked in on the children, both already asleep despite the heat. The house settled into quiet, only the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to the cooler night air, breaking the silence. Around 11:30, several enslaved people would later testify to hearing someone moving between the buildings. No one could, or would, identify who it might have been. The movements were purposeful but quiet, shadows drifting through shadows. At approximately 15 minutes past midnight, all 3 fires began. The first alarm came from Catherine Hartwell, woken by the smell of smoke. She sat upright, confused, trying to determine if she was dreaming. Then she heard the crackling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below and behind her bedroom. She shook her husband awake. Thomas, do you smell smoke?" He was slower to rouse, but once conscious, he recognized the danger immediately. They rushed into the hallway and saw smoke seeping up through the floorboards near the back of the house, coming from the direction of the kitchen wing. "Get the children!" Thomas shouted, already running toward the stairs. "Get them outside!" Catherine ran to the children's rooms. She snatched 3-year-old Thomas Jr. from his bed, screaming for Margaret to wake up and follow her. The 6-year-old, terrified and crying, stumbled after her mother as they fled down the main staircase and out the front door. Thomas Hartwell ran to the back of the house, trying to reach the kitchen wing. Heat and smoke drove him back. The fire had already engulfed the kitchen, flames climbing the walls with impossible speed. He could hear the roar of it, like some living thing feeding and growing. He stumbled outside, looking wildly around, and that's when he saw the second fire. The cotton gin house, a substantial building about 60 yards from the main residence, was also burning. Flames shot through its roof, illuminating the entire yard in flickering orange light. "Fire! Fire!" he screamed, his voice breaking with panic. "Everyone wake! Fire!" People began emerging from the enslaved people's cabins, some carrying buckets, others just standing in frozen shock. The bucket brigade, the standard response to plantation fires, began to form. But even as people ran toward the main house with water, there was a third shout, this one from a field hand named Benjamin. "Mr. Yates's house. It burning too. Impossible." That was everyone's first thought. Yates's house was 300 yards to the east, separated from both the main residence and the gin house by open ground. There was no way a fire could have spread there. Not that quickly. Not across that distance. But it was true. Flames were visible in the windows of the overseer's house, already advanced enough that the structure was clearly lost. The next 2 hours dissolved into chaos. The bucket brigade split into 3 groups, but each fire was already too advanced to contain. The kitchen wing of the main house was engulfed, and despite desperate efforts, the fire spread to the main structure. Catherine Hartwell stood in the yard clutching her children, watching her home burn. Around her, Enslaved people ran with buckets, their faces lit by flames, expressions ranging from frantic effort to something harder to interpret. Thomas Hartwell abandoned the main house and focused his attention on the gin house, screaming orders, organizing men to form lines, demanding faster water delivery. But the gin house was full of highly flammable cotton and oil-soaked machinery. It burned like a torch, the heat so intense it was dangerous to approach within 20 feet. Several men ran toward Yates's house, but by the time they arrived, the structure was fully involved. They circled it, calling for Yates, getting no answer. The heat drove them back. They could do nothing but watch it burn. By 3 o'clock in the morning, all 3 buildings were reduced to smoking ruins. The main house had partially collapsed, only the front section and part of the second floor remaining. The gin house was gone entirely, just a pile of charred timbers and twisted metal. Yates' house had burned to the foundation, leaving only the brick chimney standing like a blackened tombstone. As dawn broke, painting the sky pink and gold in cruel contrast to the devastation below, Thomas Hartwell stood amid the ruins trying to comprehend what had happened. His wife and children sat on the grass near the carriageway, wrapped in blankets someone had retrieved from an untouched storage building. Around them, exhausted people collapsed where they stood, some crying, others silent. And Gideon Yates was nowhere to be found. A search party formed as soon as there was enough light to see. They approached the ruins of the overseer's house carefully, the bricks still radiating heat. What they found would become the subject of intense speculation and carefully worded official reports. Yates's body was in what had been his bedroom, burned beyond easy recognition but identifiable by location and certain personal effects. A metal belt buckle, a pocket watch, somehow partially intact. But there was something strange about the position of the remains. He appeared to have been lying in bed when the fire occurred, suggesting he'd either been overcome by smoke before he could escape or had been unconscious for some other reason. The plantation's elderly physician, Dr. Harris, was summoned from his home 5 miles away. He examined the scene as carefully as the condition of the remains allowed, and later wrote in his private journal, discovered after his death in 1841, that he suspected Yates had been dead, or at least unconscious before the fire consumed him. But he could never prove it, and his official report simply stated, "Death by fire." The investigation that followed was perfunctory. The local magistrate, William Crenshaw, arrived the next day with 2 deputies. They interviewed Thomas and Catherine Hartwell, several of the enslaved workers, and examined the 3 fire sites. What they found troubled them deeply, but left them with no clear answers. All 3 fires had originated inside the buildings, not outside. This ruled out the possibility of a single spark from one fire spreading to the others. The distances were simply too great, and there had been no wind that night. Each fire had its own independent origin point. The fire in the main house kitchen appeared to have started in or near the cooking hearth, but the hearth had been properly banked for the night. According to both Dinah and Ruth's testimony, the fire in the gin house seemed to have started near the mechanical equipment, where oil and cotton fibers created a dangerous combination. But that area was always checked before the building was secured for the night, and Jacob, who'd been the last to leave it, swore he'd performed his usual inspection and found everything secure. The fire in Yates's house appeared to have started in multiple points, the bedroom and the small parlor, almost simultaneously. This was the most troubling finding, mentioned in Crenshaw's sealed report, but never publicly discussed. Magistrate Crenshaw interviewed the enslaved workers individually, asking where each person had been when the fires started. The answers were consistent but ultimately unhelpful. Most had been asleep in their cabins. Several had been outside, unable to sleep in the oppressive heat, but no one admitted to being near any of the buildings that burned. He asked specifically about Dinah, Ruth, Jacob, and Moses, the 4 people most frequently mentioned in others' testimony as leaders or influential figures in the enslaved community. All 4 had been in their cabins, according to their own statements and witnesses who corroborated seeing them there. Did anyone have grievances against Overseer Yates? Crenshaw asked. A delicate question in a system built on forced labor and brutality. The answers were careful. Yes, Yates had been strict. Yes, he administered punishment when he felt it was warranted. No, nothing unusual had happened recently, except, well, there was the matter of young Peter being whipped, but that was 4 days before the fire. Several people mentioned it, almost as if wanting it in the record but not knowing what to do with the information. Crenshaw questioned Peter himself, the young man still recovering from his injuries. Peter said he'd been asleep in his cabin when the fires started, that he hadn't left all night. His mother confirmed this, said she'd been watching over him. The magistrate examined the timing. For all 3 fires to have started within minutes of each other, either multiple people were involved, which would require coordination and secrecy among a large group, or one person had moved very quickly between 3 distant points, starting each fire in rapid succession. Neither explanation seemed plausible. Could it have been an accident, some bizarre confluence of separate incidents? That seemed even less likely. 3 independent fires, all starting within the same 15-minute window, each advancing rapidly enough to destroy substantial buildings. Crenshaw wrote in his official report, "The fires appear to have been set deliberately, but no evidence points conclusively to any individual or group. The simultaneous nature of the event suggests coordination, but the logistics of such coordination seem impractical, given the distances involved and the lack of any witness testimony indicating collaborative action." He noted one other thing, almost in passing. Several of the enslaved workers interviewed displayed an unusual calmness when describing the events, as if the disaster had been expected or understood on some level not accessible to this investigation. His final conclusion was unsatisfying but honest. Without additional evidence or testimony, this investigation cannot determine the responsible parties. The fires are ruled as suspicious origin, case to remain open pending new information. No new information ever emerged. The case was never solved, and Crenshaw's decision to seal parts of his report for 43 years suggested he'd found something that troubled him enough to hide it. Or perhaps he'd simply given up trying to explain the inexplicable. In the days and weeks following the fire, the Hartwell plantation became a scene of difficult decisions and fractured lives. Thomas and Catherine Hartwell moved temporarily into a tenant house on the property while considering their options. The financial impact was devastating. The main house had not been fully insured. The gin house represented a massive loss of equipment and stored cotton. And Yates' death meant finding and training a new overseer. But there was another problem, one that Thomas Hartwell confronted with increasing anxiety. The enslaved workforce knew something he didn't. He could see it in their faces, in the way they moved and spoke and looked at him. There was no open defiance, no rebellion, just a quiet awareness, a sense of shared knowledge that excluded him entirely. He called Moses to meet with him 3 days after the fire. They stood in the yard where the gin house had been, ash still drifting in the slight breeze. "You know something," Hartwell said. It wasn't a question. Moses looked at him with those deep-set eyes that seemed much older than his years. "I know what everyone knows, sir. There was a fire. 3 fires, at the same time, miles apart. Yes, sir, strange thing. More than strange, impossible." Moses was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." It was such a platitude, such a standard deflection, that Hartwell almost struck him. But something in Moses's tone made him hesitate. It wasn't mockery exactly, but it wasn't submission either. It was simply statement of fact. "If you know something about how those fires started, I know the same as you, sir. I was asleep, then I heard the alarm, then I helped carry water. That's all I know about what happened." The careful phrasing, what happened, not how it happened, or who did it, just what happened. Hartwell let him go, knowing the conversation had yielded nothing and everything at the same time. Moses knew. They all knew. But knowing and proving were different things, and in the coded language of the plantation system, certain truths could exist without ever being spoken aloud. Catherine Hartwell had her own suspicions, focused primarily on Dinah and Ruth. They'd been the last to leave the kitchen that night. They'd banked the fire, they'd locked the door. The fire had started there. But when she questioned Dinah directly, the older woman's face remained impassive. "I did everything same as always, ma'am. Same as every night for 20 years. Fire was low, coals covered, nothing burning that shouldn't be. But something went wrong. Yes, ma'am, something went wrong." The way she said it, factual, unemotional, carrying no hint of guilt or defensiveness, made Catherine deeply uneasy. She dismissed Dinah but found herself unable to shake the feeling that she'd just been told something important without any actual information being conveyed. The plantation struggled through the late summer and fall. A new overseer was hired, a man named Curtis who came with good references but lacked Yates's experience. The cotton crop was harvested, but without the gin, it had to be transported to a neighboring plantation for processing, cutting into already reduced profits. Thomas Hartwell spent more time away from the plantation, dealing with creditors in Charleston, trying to negotiate extensions on his debts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The new overseer, Curtis, was not a gentle man. No overseer in that system could afford to be. But he was less cruel than Yates had been. He seemed to understand in some instinctive way that he was walking on ground where something had happened. Some line had been crossed, and that crossing it again would be unwise. The punishments decreased. The rations improved slightly. Work hours remained long but stopped extending into the night. It wasn't freedom, wasn't justice, wasn't even basic human decency by any reasonable standard, but it was measurably better than what had come before, and everyone on the plantation understood, without it ever being stated, that this change was somehow connected to that August night. The rebuilding began in early 1824. Thomas Hartwell, unable to secure enough capital to rebuild the main house to its former size, constructed a smaller residence. The gin house was rebuilt in a new location, farther from the main buildings. The overseer's position remained filled by Curtis, who chose to live in a newly constructed house on the opposite side of the property from where Yates's had stood. Dinah continued to cook for the family, training Ruth in the skills that would eventually be passed to another generation. Jacob continued to repair and maintain equipment, his skilled hands steady and reliable. Moses continued to lead prayer meetings, his voice still resonant, still making prophecy sound like history and history sound like prophecy. And the secret of August 14, 1823, remained held by those who knew it and never shared it with those who didn't. In 1826, Thomas Hartwell sold the plantation. He claimed it was for financial reasons, and that was certainly part of the truth. The debts he'd accumulated were substantial, and the fire had destroyed any chance of recovering his position. But those who knew him noted that he never seemed comfortable on the property after the fire, never quite able to shake the feeling that he was being watched and judged by forces he could neither see nor control. The new owner, a Charleston merchant named Randolph Dunmore, purchased the property and its enslaved workers as a package. The plantation operated under his ownership until 1847, when he died and the property passed to his son. During those 21 years, the plantation was never particularly prosperous, but it was also never the site of any notable tragedy or disaster. Dinah died in 1832 at approximately 49 years old. She was buried in the enslaved people's cemetery on the plantation, her grave marked only with a simple wooden cross that has long since rotted away. Ruth continued her mother's work until she was sold in 1835 to a plantation further inland, a common fate, families separated by economic necessity or owner's whim. Jacob lived until 1838, when he died of injuries sustained in a wagon accident. Some wondered in whispers whether the accident had truly been accidental, whether he'd known something that eventually made him a liability. But there was never any evidence of foul play. He was buried near Dinah, in the section of land that enslaved people had claimed for their own eternal rest. Moses lived the longest, surviving until 1844. In his final years, his role as spiritual leader of the enslaved community became more prominent, and his prayer meetings were attended by dozens of people. When he died, people came from several neighboring plantations to pay their respects, a rare occurrence that spoke to the impact he'd had on many lives. He was buried in the same cemetery, his grave eventually marked by a field stone on which someone had scratched a rough cross. The three of them, Dinah, Jacob, and Moses, were remembered by the enslaved community long after their deaths. Stories were passed down, though always carefully, always in coded language that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the listener. They understood things, old-timers would say. They knew what was needed, others would add. That night, the three fires burned. Some would whisper, justice came in the only way it could. But it was always speculation, always implication, never direct statement. The secret, if secret it was, remained protected by those who held it. Peter, the young man whose whipping had preceded the fire, lived until 1863. He was 40 years old when the Civil War finally reached the Carolina Low Country and Union forces occupied the region. In the chaos of the war's end and the beginning of Reconstruction, he gained his freedom. He lived another 4 years as a free man, working as a laborer in Charleston, before dying of yellow fever in 1867. He never spoke publicly about August 14, 1823, though some claimed he carried scars from that night's whipping until the day he died, physical reminders of the system that had brutalized him and so many others. The Hartwell plantation itself changed hands several times in the decades following Thomas Hartwell's sale. Each owner tried to make the property profitable with varying degrees of success. The main house that replaced the burned one still stood as of 1860, though by then it showed signs of neglect. The Civil War brought destruction to much of the Low Country, and the Hartwell property did not escape damage. By 1868, the plantation system had collapsed, the enslaved people freed, and the economic structure of the entire region transformed. The former Hartwell plantation was divided and sold in parcels. Some of the land went to formerly enslaved people trying to establish their own farms during Reconstruction, though most of those efforts were later undermined by violence and legal manipulation. Other parcels were purchased by northern investors or local whites trying to adapt to the new economic reality. The section of land where the three fires had burned, the main house location, the gin house site, and the spot where Yates's house had stood, remained largely unused. Local people, both black and white, seemed to avoid it. Several attempts to build on those sites were abandoned, the reasons varying. Foundation problems, disputes over property lines, lack of capital. But underlying all the practical reasons was a vague discomfort, a sense that something had happened there that had never been fully resolved or understood. In 1873, a journalist from Charleston visited the area, researching a series of articles on the transformation of low-country plantations after the war. He interviewed several elderly, formerly enslaved people, recording their memories of the old system. One woman, whose name he recorded only as Aunt Sarah, age listed as approximately 70, told him about the Hartwell plantation and the night of the three fires. "I was young then," she said, "but I remember 3 fires all at once. They said it couldn't be done, but it was. They said nobody could have done it, but somebody did, or maybe several somebodies we never knew for sure. But I'll tell you this, after that night, things got better. Not good, but better, and sometimes that's the most you can hope for. Sometimes that's what justice looks like." The journalist asked her if she knew who had started the fires. She looked at him with eyes that had seen slavery, war, and freedom, and said, "I know what everybody knows. There was 3 fires. They burned, and some things that needed burning got burned up." He pressed her, but she would say nothing more. He interviewed several other people, getting similar responses. Acknowledgement of the fires, vague suggestions of justice or divine intervention, but no direct accusations or confessions. He eventually abandoned that part of his article, deciding it was impossible to get clear information about events 50 years in the past. But he wrote in his personal diary, never published during his lifetime. There is a story here, carefully guarded. The people I interviewed know more than they're telling, but they've kept the secret for half a century and have no intention of sharing it with a stranger. Whatever happened that night, whoever was responsible, they've become part of a collective memory that serves a purpose beyond historical accuracy. They've become symbol and lesson combined, a reminder that the impossible can happen when enough people will it into being. The mystery of the 3 simultaneous fires at the Hartwell Plantation has never been solved in any official sense. No confession was ever made, no evidence ever emerged that conclusively identified the person or people responsible. The sealed portions of Magistrate Crenshaw's report, discovered in 1866 during courthouse renovations, added few new facts, but confirmed what many had suspected. Crenshaw himself believed the fires were deliberately set as an act of coordinated resistance, but felt he lacked sufficient evidence to prosecute anyone. His private notes found with the report included this passage. The logistics suggest either one person moving with impossible speed and precision, or multiple people acting in perfect coordination without any detectable communication. Neither seems plausible, yet one must be true. The alternative, that 3 unrelated accidental fires occurred simultaneously in 3 separate locations, is statistically impossible. I am forced to conclude that this investigation has failed, not for lack of diligence, but because the truth is being protected by a community that sees no benefit in revealing it. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps some truths are best left unspoken. Modern analysis of the case, conducted by historians studying slavery and resistance in the antebellum South, has offered several theories. The most commonly accepted theory among scholars suggests that at least 3 people were directly involved in setting the fires, with many others providing covering alibis and maintaining collective silence afterward. The precision of the timing would require careful planning and coordination, possibly using signals or prearranged timings based on natural markers like moon position or insect sounds. In this interpretation, Dinah, Jacob, and Moses are seen as probable leaders or coordinators, but dozens of others must have been aware and complicit. A second theory proposes that one person, most likely Jacob, given his freedom of movement and technical knowledge, set all 3 fires using carefully prepared delayed ignition methods. Slow-burning fuses or other timing mechanisms, while crude by later standards, were not unknown in the 1820s. This theory explains the simultaneous fires while requiring fewer active participants, though it still requires many people to maintain silence afterward. A third theory, less widely accepted but intriguing, suggests that the fires were indeed accidents, separate, unrelated incidents that happened to occur on the same night. Proponents point out that cotton gin houses were notoriously fire-prone, cooking fires in plantation kitchens were dangerous, and houses heated with fireplaces and lit with candles frequently burned. The simultaneous nature could be coincidence, with the subsequent conspiracy of silence arising not because people knew who was responsible, but because they were glad for the result regardless of the cause. But each theory has problems. The coordinated action theory requires dozens of people to have kept a perfect secret for decades, with not a single person breaking under pressure, making a deathbed confession, or revealing the truth after gaining freedom. The single-actor theory requires technical sophistication that seems unlikely for the time and place, and the accident theory requires accepting a statistical near-impossibility. What's most fascinating about the case, from a historical perspective, is what it reveals about resistance within the slavery system. Whether the fires were deliberately set or not, the reaction to them, the collective silence, the coded language, the careful protection of any incriminating information, demonstrates a level of organized resistance that white enslavers feared deeply and often refused to acknowledge. The enslaved people of the Hartwell Plantation created and maintained a counter-narrative, a story that existed alongside the official investigation but never intersected with it. In their version, August 14th, 1823, was a night when justice arrived through mysterious but somehow appropriate means. Whether that justice took human form or divine form was deliberately left ambiguous, allowing each person to interpret the events according to their own understanding and conscience. Physical evidence of the fires has long since disappeared. The plantation site has been developed and redeveloped over nearly 200 years. A modern subdivision now occupies part of the land, with no markers indicating what once stood there. The enslaved people's cemetery, where Dinah, Jacob, and Moses were buried along with dozens of others, was located on a section of land that became a county road in the 1920s. The bodies were never formally relocated, and the cemetery's exact location is now lost. But the story persists, passed down through generations of descendants, both of the enslaved and the enslavers. It exists in family histories, in local folklore, in academic studies of slavery and resistance. The details vary depending on the teller. Some versions emphasize divine intervention, others human cunning, still others the simple coincidence of multiple events. But the core remains the same. On August 14th, 1823, 3 fires burned simultaneously across the Hartwell plantation, destroying property, killing an overseer, and changing the lives of everyone involved. The question of who did it has never been answered and likely never will be. But perhaps that's not the most important question. Perhaps the more significant question is, why does it matter? Why has this particular incident been remembered, studied, and discussed for 2 centuries, while countless other acts of resistance and rebellion have been forgotten? Maybe it's because the 3 simultaneous fires represent something larger than a single act of resistance or revenge. They represent the impossibility at the heart of the slavery system itself, the impossibility of keeping human beings in bondage indefinitely, the impossibility of maintaining absolute control over people who retain their capacity to think and plan and act, the impossibility of predicting or preventing resistance when the alternative is endless suffering. The fires were impossible in the same way that slavery was supposed to be permanent and inevitable. Both impossibilities turned out to be false. The fires proved that determined people could accomplish what seemed logistically unfeasible. And the fires, in their own small way, foreshadowed the much larger fires that would eventually burn across the entire South during the Civil War, destroying the slavery system itself. For the people who lived through that night, the truth of what happened and who was responsible may have been clear. For those of us looking back across 2 centuries, we can only see shadows and echoes. But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the ambiguity, the unanswered questions, the carefully maintained silence are all part of what makes the story meaningful. The people who knew, who really knew, took their knowledge to their graves. They left behind only the facts that couldn't be disputed. 3 fires, 1 night, 1 overseer dead, and a plantation that was forever changed. The rest is mystery, speculation, and the kind of justice that exists outside official systems and documented histories. On hot August nights in the low country, when the air is thick and the sky heavy with clouds that won't release their rain, some people claim they can still smell smoke drifting across the land where the Hartwell plantation once stood. It's almost certainly imagination, the power of suggestion combined with atmospheric conditions that remind one of fire. But local storytellers like the image, and so it persists. The story of the 3 fires has become part of the region's identity, a reminder of the dark history that shaped the land and the people who live on it. It's taught in some local schools, included in historical tours, and referenced in academic work about slavery and resistance in the antebellum South. But the deeper story, the one about who did it and how and why, the one that Dinah and Ruth and Jacob and Moses and dozens of others knew but never told, that story remains locked away, protected by time and death and the decision of an entire community to keep their secrets. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some victories, achieved through methods that were necessary but could never be openly acknowledged, deserve to be celebrated without being fully explained. Maybe the mystery is part of the memorial, a way of honoring not just what was done, but the courage it took to do it and the discipline it took to never speak of it afterward. What do you think of this story? Do you believe it was coordinated action, a lone actor, or impossible coincidence? Could something like this really have happened, or has 2 centuries of storytelling turned fact into legend? Leave your comment below with your theory. And if you're fascinated by these dark historical mysteries that blur the line between fact and folklore, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves untold stories from America's past. There are countless more mysteries waiting to be explored, stories that challenge us to think about history in new ways. See you in the next video.